said or says. And in the century since the Fed's founding, it has become only more embedded in a set of traditions all its own. Once we have this view of Fed policy making a view better informed by law, history, and practice, we'll have an easier time finding a common frame for debating any question about the Fed's past and present. Even when we disagree what we would hope for the Fed's future, as Bagot said of his own central bank, it is our duty to examine the system on which these great masses of money are manipulated and assure ourselves that it is safe and right. Settling on a more coherent and authentic frame for analyzing that system is the first step. Plan of the book. To reach the goal of providing that understanding, the book is structured around the following questions. What do we mean by the Fed, and how did we take the shape it has taken? How did it take the shape it has taken? What does the Fed do? Who influences the Fed policies? And is the Fed we have the Fed we want? In part 1, we look at the first two questions. What is the Fed and where did it come from? When people describe the Fed, they usually do so in one or two ways. As a single monolith, the Fed announces a change in interest rates, or the Federal Reserve bails an AIG, or as the institutional shadow of single individual Yellen announces a change in interest rates, or Bernanke bails it out AIG. The common assumption is that the Fed chair equals the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve is an indivisible whole. This assumption is false. The Fed is not single individual, and the view that the Fed's power is concentrated into the hands of one is not correct. In fact, the Fed is one of the most organizationally complex entities in the federal government, and has been from the very beginning. Part 1 tells the story of how the Fed took the curious shape that it has took, not only at the beginning in 1913, but through what Chapter 1 calls the Fed's three foundings, in 1913, 1935, and 1951. My argument that the Fed is a they, not an it, can be exaggerated. Not all actors within the Fed are equal. The influence of the Fed chairs, especially in the second half of its history, has been important, often decisive. Part of the Fed's institutional change occurs through the exercise of individual leadership by Fed chairs. Even though the Federal Reserve Act gives them no particular legal claim for the authority, but even when the Fed chair dominates, the Fed remains a complicated, multidimensional institution. Part 1 looks beyond the chair to these other features of the Fed's governance. It analyzes the role of the Fed's two powerful committees. The 7-person Board of Governors, consisting of presidential appointments confirmed by Senate, and the Federal Open Market Committee consists of the Board of Governors, plus the presidents of the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, only 5 of whom vote at a given time, who are appointed through a convoluted process, almost completely outside the public eye. The president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York is a permanent member of the committee. The other 11 reserve banks rotate as voting members in the other 4 seats. All 12 of the Reserve Bank presidents are in the room for FOMC meetings, though, and can make their views heard without restriction. By statute, the FOMC determines the Fed's monetary policies. The Board of Governors determines the rest. As we will see, the oversimplification is part of the Fed's governance problem. Figure 0.3 presents a graphical display of these committees. Part 1 also confronts the expansive influence that 2 other actors have on the Fed's policy-making space: the Fed staff. Economists and lawyers and the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks. The banks are perhaps the most controversial and least defensible aspect of the Fed's governance structure. They present a seat at the table for private bankers, representatives to make essential economic policy decisions. There are policy, constitutional, and governance problems. with the reserve banks and not enough of the value to justify the current structure given those serious costs. Part 2 then turns to the question of the Fed's many missions. The logic of the Ulysses Punchbowl view of the Federal Reserve depends on the idea that politicians will mismanage a nation's currency with an undesirable inflationary bias. The story of the development of that understanding is fascinating and important in its own right, but that account suffers from the two weaknesses. The politics of money and inflation are not so straightforward, and the Fed is not now and never has been exclusively concerned with managing price stability. Part 2 explores the Fed's varied missions by asking and answering the surprisingly difficult question, what does the Federal Reserve do? The answer, many things beyond controlling inflation. The Ulysses Punchbowl theory of Fed independence doesn't hold up for most of them. In Part 3, we look at the outsiders who influence Fed policies. The Ulysses Punchbowl view of the Fed independence focuses on the presidents. And there we will begin. Part 3 then moves on to Congress, an essential audience for influencing Fed policy. It discusses the influence that individual members of Congress can have in defining the institution. Most of the focus, though, is on an especially curious quirk of the Fed policy-making space. Congress does not use its traditional spending power to control the Fed. Instead, the Fed has that power on its own. It essentially creates the money with which it funds itself. What's more, this power is not directly authorized by statute. Part 3 explores the history and legal structure of the Fed's budgetary autonomy. Part 3 also continues to develop one of the primary themes of this book. Law as written in the Federal Reserve Act matters, but not in the way that scholars, politicians, central bankers, and even lawyers have assumed. This book concludes with part 4 now, a single chapter that discusses how the comprehensive approach to Fed power advanced. Here translates into a concrete program for Fed reform. That program focuses on preserving the best of Ulysses Punchbowl account of Fed independence. What do we really want? A central bank that will protect the currency from the winds of electoral politics, without losing the benefits of democratic legitimacy and without indulging the myth that all central bank policy is purely technocratic. We can and should be comfortable with the reality that central bankers, like everyone else, are people whose life experiences, including their technical training, give them an ideological frame of reference through which they evaluate the world. The key to reforming the Fed is to know as much about the values of those central bankers as possible. The watchword in this pragmatic approach is governance. Governance refers to institutional decisions about who inside the Fed gets to establish which policies. As it stands today, the Fed's governance is simply put, it's a mess. It can, should, and be clarified without sacrificing the essential task of regulating inflation and employment free from the overwhelming influence of electoral politics. Consistent with the goals of Chapter 11 highlights a few positive recent developments in reforming the Fed, including the creation of a separate Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and recommend a few new changes to the Fed's structure and governance, including the reform of the 12 Federal Reserve banks. Two of the themes in this book permeate each chapter. First, any conversation about the Fed's power must recognize law's inability to remain what its authors intended it to be. That is not to say that we should abandon the enterprise of statutory central bank design. It means instead that we should tailor those efforts to minimize new legal rules that might well subject future generations to. That's how the book presents the words. Misprint, possibly. Many dead hands of the past. And second, an inescapable reality of central banking is that central bankers are people who bring with them ideologies and values that shape how they exercise their authority over the economy. Those values are also not fixed interaction with others outside the Federal Reserve System. shape how central bankers think about the problems they confront. For both reasons, focus on understanding and simplifying Federal Reserve governance is an essential task to studying and reforming the Federal Reserve. The U.S. Federal Reserve System has an extraordinary century. In the words of one scholar, the Fed's evolution into an economic power of first-rate importance is the most remarkable bureaucratic metamorphosis in American history. This book challenges to the prevailing view of the Federal Reserve. Power and independence is meant to invite greater understanding into the remarkable metamorphosis. While grappling with the Fed's full practical historical context, the Fed's mystique is a function of both a lack of public knowledge of its inner workings and a tangled governance structure that misleads even the experts. This book seeks to increase public understanding of the Fed's many moving parts and to reconceive them in a way that allows for a better, more fruitful understanding of this essential institution. Part 1. The Federal Reserve is a they, not an it. Public and scholarly attention on the Fed usually focuses on a monolithic it, or on the personal she or he. In fact, the standard grammatical practice followed in this book, and indeed in the last sentence, it is to refer to the Federal Reserve, or just the Fed. I just call it the Federal Reserve. That's what I refer to it as a proper noun. This is an institutional and grammatical error. The term Federal Reserve is not a noun, but a compound adjective. Okay, it's an adjective. There are Federal Reserve banks, Federal Reserve notes, a Federal Reserve board, and taken together a Federal Reserve system, all created by the Federal Reserve Act. Who wrote this book? Someone who wrote a dictionary and called it an adjective, or an author who never took part in the literacy practices of writing the dictionary, was one of the actual person who got in like that, like someone who wrote an interpretation of the Bible of its many versions. No more philosophy, let's just keep going. Okay, Federal Reserve notes, a Federal Reserve Board, and taken together a Federal Reserve system, all created by a Federal Reserve Act. But there is no Federal Reserve by itself. This vocabulary failure reveals a harder problem for those thinking about the Federal Reserve System, even though we are rarely referred to it as such. To paraphrase Kenneth Shepsel, that's his last name maybe, the Fed is a they, not an it. This is not a pedantic grammatical point. By the way, a lot of this language is not in use everyday life if you walk down the modern streets of 2019. Understanding the Fed's complex internal governance structure, all those instructions and actors within the Federal Reserve System is essential to understanding the Fed's power, the space within which it makes policy. It also represents a problem of governance. When the public is faced with a monolith, all debates about Fed actions, no matter where they occur within the system, no matter what those actions may be, easily spiral into confusion. Part 1 is an effort to focus attention on the Fed's governance by tracing the history of the Fed's institutional development through what this book calls the Fed's three foundings in 1913, 1935, and 1951. With this history in place, chapters 2 through 5 then consider the influence that respectively the Fed shares, members of the Board of Governors, Fed staff, and the quasi-private reserve banks have on the way the Fed wields its authority within and beyond the government. Chapter 1. The three foundings of the Federal Reserve. In the last century, a favorite subject of literacy, literary ingenuity, and conjectural history, as it was then called, upon grounds of probability, a fictitious, I love that, sketch was made of the possible origin of things existing. The real history is very different. Walter Begot, 1873. That guy is getting a lot of shout-outs in this book, just saying. In the usual retelling of the Fed's history, the Fed came as Congress's answer to the problem of the mortality of J. Pierpont Morgan. The financial panic of 1907 was a dark one, but unluckily for the U.S. financial system, Morgan, the legendary international banker, saved the day and stemmed the panic, and the system lived to fight another day. Congress recognized that it couldn't count on Morgan forever, so it got its central banking act together. After two failed attempts and passed the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, the United States has a central bank ever since. As Begot says, the real history is very different. The problem with the story is that while the bare facts are true, the arc of the narrative is not. There was a financial panic in 1907. Morgan was involved, and the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 created something called the Federal Reserve System. What the story misses is the epic fight to determine what of the central banking system we would have in 1913. How the chosen system failed and had to be refounded. And how the modern sense of a central bank didn't come into being until nearly 40 years into the Fed's history. Into the Fed's history. Okay. So, how the chosen system failed and had to be refounded, and how the modern sense of the central bank didn't come into being until nearly 40 years into the Fed's history. This chapter tells the fuller narrative and looks at the three foundings of the Federal Reserve in 1913, 1935, and an informal agreement in 1951 called the Fed Treasury Accord. At each founding, there were two ideas about who should wield power within the Federal Reserve System. First is Paul Warburg, one of the characters of the 1913 Fed, put in the prevailing views at the time were either complete governmental control, which meant politics and banking, or control by Wall Street, which meant banking and politics. In other words, the question was private versus public control. And second, the successive generations of Fed founders worried about centralization and decentralization. The uneven resolution of these two debates guided the institutional development of the Fed toward the unique place in the government that it occupies today. It is unsurprising that these two questions would figure so prominently in the Fed's history. They have been with us since the beginning of the Republic. Related questions pit Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson against Alexander Hamilton and Nicholas Biddle, or Biddle. Belittle bridal showers. It's Nicholas Biddle. Okay? That's what we'll call him. In the early 19th century, in fact, it is not a stretch to say that the partisan politics in the United States birthed by a government bank midwife. As the 19th century financial historian Albert Bowles put it, or Bowles put it, when the smoke of the consent contest, other government banks had cleared away two political parties that might be seen, whose opposition through varying much in conviction, power, and earnestness has never ceased. How did these disputes, centralization versus decentralization, public versus private, manifest themselves in the internal governance structures of the Fed as imagined by its congressional sponsors? The historical backdrop is worth exploring at length. It is at the core of the effort to map the geography of Fed power and independence. The first founding, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. The conventional retelling of the Fed's founding starts in the right place, the financial panic of 1907, one of the most destructive in the nation's history. In what retelling the panic was an accelerating financial bloodletting that the U.S. government could do nothing to staunch. It was only the intervention of the towering figure of Anglo-American finance in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, J. Pierpont Morgan, that subdued the panic. Morgan, it was reported by his associates at the time, was the man of the hour, whose pronouncements, bland and obvious in retrospect, such as if people will keep their money in their banks, everything will be all right, assumed talismanic significance. A sleepless night of Morgan's banking associates, looking by Morgan in his smoky library, led to the salvation of U.S. financial system. As the story goes, after the financial panic, private bankers and government officials decided that an all eyes turned to Morgan approach to financial panics could not continue to be the basis of U.S. banking policies. After a secret meeting of bankers and their political sponsors in the U.S. Congress at the Jekyll Island Club, located on an island of some of the same coasts of Georgia, the Federal Reserve scheme was hatched. Given this secret Jekyll Island meeting came complete with disguises and code names and omerta-like oaths of secrecy, and only became 20 years after the fact. It has been grist for the conspiracist mills in the years since President Woodrow Wilson signed the bill into law as the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. This is again the conventional retelling, and again, the elements are true. There really was an extraordinary global financial panic of 1907. J.P. Morgan really did have a role, although the role has been grossly exaggerated, in arresting the spread of contagion. A secret meeting of bankers and politicians did take place in Jekyll Island, and the Federal Reserve Act 1913 did eventually follow. But from the perspective of the structure the Federal Reserve System would take, including especially its governance, the story tells us almost nothing. The primary problem with this retelling is that it links almost ineluctably the Panic of 1907 and the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 with a pit stop by the mysterious island meeting of a cabal of New York bankers. If we to understand the Fed, where its unique governance came from, these uncritical links are a mistake. The 6 years in between the Panic of 1907 and the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 were decisive for the fate of the reserve system, including as they did 2 presidential and 3 congressional elections. When the electoral dust settled, power shifted from Republicans at the time, the bankers' primary supporters in Congress, to Democrats. The House changed in 1910, the Senate in 1912. At the center of the political moment was the presidential election of 1912. Few presidential elections in U.S. history match it for its drama. Gone were the stead front porch campaigns between 2 senior partisans. Instead, the election pitted 2 U.S. presidents, Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, against Woodrow, a college president who had entered politics just 2 years before. On the edge, but not the fringe, was the most popular socialist in American history, Eugene Debs, who captured 5% of the vote. Historians have debated how much policy daylight stood between the 3 main candidates, although there was little doubt that Debs represented something very different from the perception at the time, and continuing today was aspirations of each candidate represented distinct approaches to the role of government in society. In the words of one historian in 1912 election verged on political philosophy. That political philosophical moment in American history intervened between 1907 and the Federal Reserve Act in ways that were essential in shaping the system's curious governance structure. Conspiracy theorists get close to their target in noting the existence and significance of the Jekyll Island meeting. The leading popular account of the conspiracist is called The Creature from Jekyll Island, that exposed that sets off into the dark forest to do battle with evil dragons. But they don't quite hit it. The reality is that the creature established in the meeting and sponsored by the Republicans in 1910 bore little relation from a governance perspective to the Federal Reserve System, ultimately embraced by Woodrow Wilson as his greatest domestic accomplishment. Signed into law on December 23, 1913, the difference was partisan politics. The first proposals following the Panic of 1907 were entirely Republican. Senator Nelson Aldrich was a Republican leading the monetary reform efforts in 1908. Congress passed the Aldrich-Vreeland Act, which created the National Monetary Commission, which Aldrich at the head of. This commission imagined a structure very different from the system the Federal Reserve Act eventually created. The structure, the National Reserve Association, NRA, we're not talking about rifles here, was to be a mix of the public and private appointments, but dramatically weighted toward the private. For example, the board of the NRA, National Reserve Association, not National Rifle Association to clarify, National Reserve Association, was at 46 directors, 42 of whom, indulging its 3 executive officers, were to be appointed directly and indirectly by the banks. The government did not figure into the scene at all. As the Republicans failed in successive elections, the NRA approach to Fed governance failed to carry the day. The emphasis here is the Fed's government. Much of the Republican believed Bill survived in the final act as far as the new system functions were concerned, but its governance was another matter, the money trust. At the same time, the shift from Republicans was taking place. The country was rocked by hearings on the so-called money trust, led by Louisiana Democrat Arsenio Pujol, himself a former member of Aldrich's National Monetary Commission. In these hearings, led by famed lawyer Samuel Untermeyer, J.P. Morgan himself appeared to answer to charge that nations' money and credit were subject to the same kind of monopolistic control as its sugar, steel, oil, or railroads had been had. That charge was that these New York bankers were using other people's money to enrich themselves at the expense of the rest of society. Morgan was compelled to appear in one of the most famous exchanges of the hearings. Untermeyer asked Morgan to explain the basis on which they could get a loan on what security of collateral, on the theory that the wealthy would qualify for loans through Morgan's banks. Morgan refused to concede the point. The provision of credit had no relation whatever to do with this net worth of the man requesting it. An incredulous Untermeyer pressed Morgan. It's not commercial credit based primarily on money or property, ? Came the improbable answer. No, sir. The first thing is character. A man I do not trust could not get money from me on all the bonds in Christendom. As quotable as Morgan was, he was humiliated by the hearings and angry that his character had been tarnished. He would die just weeks after the hearings. The victim, according to his family, of Untermeyer's cross-examination. In a short time, he had gone from J.P. Morgan, the savior of the financial system, to J.P. Morgan, the money monopolist. The financial final governance structure of the Federal Reserve System owed itself to that transition. The Wilsonian Compromise. As a result of the elections and the money trust hearings, the Democrats were ready to make the cause of currency reform, as the issue was known, their own. Recall the 2 poles that formed the basis of the government's controversy: centralization and public versus private control. On one end sat Paul Warburg, the German immigrant banker whose ideas in the early 1900s set the stage for the bunch of the debate preceding the enactment of the Federal Reserve Act. Warburg feared public influence over the new central bank as institution that he, a private banker in the old school European banking tradition, viewed as a necessarily private one. Carter Glass, the initial Democratic proponent of the bill, wasn't interested in governmental aspect of the decision. He was much more worried about the central versus decentralization aspect of the governance problem than the private versus public one. As much of the Republican bankers distrusted politicians in control of bank, Glass and the Democrats feared the bankers' control of politicians. The best solution of the Glass perspective wasn't to give the keys to the financial kingdom to the politicians. It was to take the keys away from the New York City bankers. Thus, Glass's answer to the governance problem was a private, decentralized sea of central banks spread throughout the country. Wilson took a different view. This student of governmental structures saw the opportunity for constitution making in the tradition of one of his heroes, James Madison. Wilson wanted public control but recognized the need to compromise among the various factions. His proposal of Washington-based government control supervisory board of the preferred on the top of the central private decentralized central banks flung by Carter Glass throughout the country. When the banks and Glass both protested, Wilson imperiously well, I just say impressively, asked, "Will one of the gentlemen tell me what civilized country of the earth there are important government boards of control on which private interests are represented?" Hearing no objection, he followed up, "Which you gentlemen thinks the railroads should select members of the Interstate Commerce Commission?" While the bankers continued to protest, Carter Glass was controverted to Wilson positions. Before they had even exited the office, Wilson carried the day in what might be called the Wilsonian Compromise of 1913. Before Wilson, the hybrid institution did not exist in paper or in thought. The result was mostly supervisory, leanly staffed Federal Reserve Board based in Washington. The board would include the Secretary of the Treasury of the ex officio chair of the system, with the comptroller of the currency, until then the exclusive federal banking regulator, also serving on the board. In addition to these two automatic appointments, the board consisted of 5 presidential appointees serving 10-year terms. Each of the rest of the system consisted of 8 to 12 reserve banks. The initial legislation didn't set definitive number. These reserve banks would each have a governor and a 9-person board of directors. The reserve banks would be the private features of the system. The system would not, in theory at least, be dominated by either public board or private bank. The emphasis, at least to some of these days' early framers, was on the Federal Reserve System. That emphasis meant that the balance of power was between local and national figures. Much of the U.S. Constitution had none of with states. The national governments, the balance was at the core of Glass's conception. At the new system in the United States,